Hello, hello. Thank you everybody for being here today. Today we're getting to speak with David Court, author of Scenes of Mild Peril. And we're gonna kind of do something a little bit different today. Today we're actually gonna be doing a workshop on writing comic script, graphic novel script, all that kind of stuff. Something that I personally don't know too much about, but we all like reading a comic book and a graphic novel. So let's learn how they're all put together. So without further ado, David, what are the key differences between writing a comic script and writing traditional prose?
That's an interesting one. We're as writers, we are forever having show, don't tell, rammed down our throats as one of the golden rules of writing. Whereas, of course, that's even more apparent with comics, where all you can do is show. Uh, I've written standard prose. I've written for the stage in the past, as well as comics, and I'd say the final two are the most similar in actual techniques.
Between
And
stage and comics?
yeah,
Okay.
because effectively you're writing with stage directions, but you elaborate on top of that further by you're in fact inventing the stage as well, I suppose. It was quite an eye opener first getting into comics because there's a lot of visual language that you don't really realize comes into play with writing comics. For instance, dialogue has to be way snappier because you've got much less space to work with, and nothing is more dull than reading exposition on a page, be that in thought bubbles or speech bubbles. You need to take pacing into account. There's a whole visual language regarding that. So you might have splash pages to break up stuff. So literally, you'll turn the page and have a two-page spread of just one picture.
Yeah.
You might have panels bleeding into each other. And you've got to also take care, because if you want to do any surprises for the audience, you need to know the visual language if you don't want to be on the right-hand page of a two-page spread, because the human brain will comprehend that right hand side before you've read the left hand side. So you want any ideally, if you want to do any surprises for the audience, you need to be up the turn of a page.
That's interesting because I think there's so many different factors that play into a comic book or a graphic novel when it comes to just like the general formatting. We just had an interview with AC Cross, author of the Boddicker Letters, and we spoke about formatting in that because the story was an epistolary and went into like a descent into madness and how that played out onto the page outside of the actual text.
Mm,
But when you're getting into graphic novels and comic books, it's very much the case of you could have one page that's just one singular image, or I don't know if you run into this, but I certainly do, where I find myself unsure of the direction that I should be reading in. Like if the boxes are different sizes, how they want to go about that. You might have like an action scene that just takes like a little sliver compared to something else. But it is a good point when it comes to the text needing to be snappier, because I would also say from a reader's perspective, going into a comic book, you're not expecting a lot of text. So
no.
if you have those pages that have a lot of them, it kind of, I don't want to say turns you off of it, but you're kind of going into it with a different expectation. So it catches you off
Yes. Yeah.
guard.
And for instance, if you look at some of the Marvel work from the 1970s, where characters are literally giving three-sentence speeches between punches, and it's just like and it ruins the flow completely. But also, you have to bear in mind that because you can't necessarily see everything, characters do have to announce their actions as well.
I got really into graphic novels, I would say a few years ago, as a means of learning history. I found like nonfiction graphic novels are really interesting because they portrayed like tone and attitude and atmosphere much better than a textbook would have.
Yes, yeah. And like you were saying earlier, you sometimes struggle with the language about knowing where to follow. Any good artist worth their salt, there's a way to make the eye flow across the pages. It should be second nature. But even now, you'll pick up comics where you've got a double page spread and you're supposed to read the entire thing left to right, and but it's not made clear enough by the artist. So you end up reading a disjointed left page and then a right page when you should have been reading solidly from left to right.
Yeah, it's almost like you kind of obviously, like you said, the artwork speaks for itself, but then you could also have like the blurb explain how it all goes. But I wanted to follow up. Is there a difference between a comic book and a graphic novel?
That's in the language of it, a graphic novel is just a larger format comic, effectively with more pages.
Okay.
The most ones you'll find on comic book shelves in your bookshops will be collections of Marvel comics and the like. So issues 1 to 6 collected in one thing. But you do get examples of graphic novels that are just standalone. So they literally haven't been built. They're not an anthology of previously
Hmm.
published strips.
Hmm.
Stuff like Art Spiegelman's Mouse and Persepolis and Barry Windsor Smith's Monsters. So you do get works that are deliberately meant to be in the graphic novel format, so they haven't been serialized, and
Well,
that present.
it's in. Sorry for interrupting you there. It's interesting because I know Persepolis has a sequel, and I know that Mouse has. I think it's like 3 or 4 books, but the one that we all get is like a compilation of all of them put together. At least that's the
Yes,
copy I
yes.
have. Yeah, yeah.
But that raises interesting things for the writer as well, because the one thing when I hand my book over to someone is no one who reads it at the end of the day is aware of the process that it's gone through.
Mhm.
They're not aware of the rewrites that it's had, or me writing myself into a corner 2/3 of the way through and having to revisit and retroactively change previous stuff. The problem with releasing comics as single things is you're stuck. Once it's out there in the world, then you can't revisit it again and correct any mistakes.
Uh,
Whereas the
that's a
beauty of
good.
having a graphic novel, which is a graphic novel which is just one solid work, means you can go through the same process as a writer would with any standard text, I think.
Right, because it's one thing to change a typo here or there. It's another if like I don't like this panel, I want to change the artwork. That's a much heavier process there.
Or I didn't want to kill this character off and
Oh
realize
man,
that you did it in issue two
gotcha.
and now you're in issue four. But whereas a writer, of course, we just go back and we don't kill that character off. Comics are still a big market. It ebbs and flows, the individual issues of stuff, but there's always been a background interest there. But I personally don't. I tend not to buy single comics anymore because they take up space, and so I just wait for them to be collected. So it's a more convenient way to get them on the bookshelf.
When it comes to structuring the comic strip, what is the typical page or panel breakdown look like? Is this just entirely conducive on like, is there a format? Like if you're writing about action, this is how it should be. If you're writing about fantasy, this is how it should be. Is there like a one size fits all metric or really not at all? It's up to the artist.
It's pretty much up to the writer, to be honest with you. I've got my own format, which is adapted from. There's a comic writer called Peter David who used to write Hulk and Marvel stuff back in the day.
Mhm.
Who's got this brilliant book called Writing Comics. I think it's called Writing Comics for Peter David, and I nicked his script template because it works very well. So I think everyone just basically borrows from everyone else. So mine, the big key issue to take away from it for the artist is page numbers are always page numbers for the artist and never the page number of the document you're sending them. Because
Yeah.
I will send you an 18-page script for a 6-page comic book, effectively.
Right, interesting. I want to follow up and ask because obviously when it comes to writing a novel, just a regular novel with words, there is still a team, or like if you're self-publishing, there's still a lot of elements of it, right? You got to do the cover art, you got to do the text, you got to do the editing, the formatting, the marketing. So like there tends to be a team behind it, and obviously that's incredibly true with in the comics because there's artwork involved, and there's artwork involved much heavier than there is with just the cover art.
And
So
it's not just the artist. So you've got the line artist who does the pencil sketches. You may have a separate inker. You may have a separate colouring team as well. You may have a separate letterer. So the guy who goes away, takes the comic away and puts all these speech bubbles and thought bubbles and captions on there. Then
those
you've got
are
your editor.
those are all okay. The editor, yes, but the others, like with the speech bubble and the line writer, those are all different people.
In the bigger market there will be. For
Okay.
smaller, more independent stuff, people will share jobs. So the
Okay.
artist himself may well do the lettering. But if you move to the big people like Marvel or DC,
Yeah.
they will have separate people whose sole job is to just go in and do the lettering for comics
Interesting.
and sound effects and panels and stuff like that.
Interesting. So when it comes to obviously a lot of this is a communication between the author and the artist. How do you go about effectively communicating with the artist there?
I've always liked I like having a close relationship with the artist. I don't like a one shot and it's done. So
Mhm.
uh, some writers are very prescriptive about what they want the artist to do, as in they'll go into pages and pages of description, maybe some pencil sketches about what layout they want. I'm a writer. I've got an idea what I want to convey. The artist has got a much better idea visually about how that will look better than I have. So I'd like it to be a two-way process. So my scripting is quite loose because I would like them to do that. In fact, if they're not sure about that what's to be done, like I like a line of communication there where we can both flesh out ideas, thrash them out until it's something we're both happy with. I think it's just communication is key.
Yeah.
I don't want to be one of these writers who just sends it off and I'll wait 6 months and then you give me back the attached art. I would like it to be a collaboration because they understand the visual language of comics better than I ever will because it's what they've spent years honing and practicing and learning.
Well, it's one of those things because I know this 'cause I just did yesterday. I did another call with Bo Huffman, author of Desserts and Dragons, about like creating cover art, and it's a very like there is communication in that process, but it seems like this is much more active communication. Like whereas there you might have a couple back and forths. This it feels like you want to be a part of the entire process because it's one thing they can give you a sample panel, but if your comic book's made up of 200 panels, like that can shift and that can realign over time.
Yeah, I will, and almost definitely will over time. It's an evolving process.
Mhm. So I want to ask similar questions that I did to her in terms of when it comes to the artwork process, at what point in the process do you kind of get in touch with a artist? Like, you start writing, do you have a finished script before you reach out to the artist and a vision, or are you halfway through and you go, I need to start finding an artist? What part of that process does that take place?
In my case, it's always been a finished script. The script will get honed and refined over time because I
Mhm.
will pass that to an editor who will request the changes in conjunction with me and the artist. I've been blessed to have some very good editors over my life, which is nice.
Nice.
And also in that case, they will, because these haven't been my own comics, the editor has found a good fit. So they've read the story, they've got their pool of artists, so they know which guy or lady will be a better fit for my work.
Mhm.
For instance, you don't want someone whose skill is in anatomy, writing, drawing lots of spaceships and landscapes, and
Yeah.
vice versa.
So yeah, because that's the thing, right? You have to find an artist whose artwork reflects the voice you want to share. And
Yeah,
this is
yeah,
something we spoke on yesterday about the whole idea of like genre specifics. Like if I see a sword on a cover, I'm not going to assume that that's a sci-fi novel.
yes, yes.
So are there similar distinctions when it comes within graphic novels, within comic books of the art styles?
But if we take the example of two of my recent stories I've done. The first one was a kind of a comedy fantasy one, and the artist found for me for that was a guy called Torgo Wells, whose style is very manic, very much like the old Mad comics of the 70s and 80s,
Okay.
with big thick line work and a real good sense of kineticism for it.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas my second story for the same comic was a way more serious one, so the artist chosen for that it's really dark and somber, but everything looks a bit more realistic and but a bit more photorealistic and lit to make it
Yeah.
match kind of the horror theme of it. So again, there are so many artists out there with all of their varying different styles. So luckily, there's someone out there who can mesh the writer and the right artist for the job.
Right, and I think this is where I know that there is a space for indie graphic novels, indie comic books. We haven't had a chance. We've received a few submissions, but the sizing isn't quite right or whatnot. We would love to feature one in the future, if anyone's watching. But it's one of those things where writing indie comics doesn't necessarily feel as accessible as writing indie stories, just because
Yes,
it seems like it's just a very different process and it requires more people. And frankly, it seems like it requires more upfront investment, which could turn a lot of people off or make it a little bit less accessible.
it's a much longer process as soon as you get artists involved, just because
Mhm.
it physically takes time.
All right, if you're making cover artwork, it's kind of one flat image. How much does it cost to hire an artist for a graphic novel? Or is that more on a royalty basis? Or what is that process? Like, how do you even go about finding one?
When it comes to prices, there's kind of like I said before, there's kind of a traditional tier. The artist gets paid the most,
Mhm.
and it tends to be colorers and writers next,
Mhm.
then the letterers, then editors last. Most of the artists I knew do a page rate, so they will
Okay.
charge you X money for doing a page, and that varies on uh,
Mhm.
their previous work and how good they are. I know guys who charge as little as $100 a day for sorry, not a day for a page, and then those who go up to 250, 350. And then there are some artists who literally only do covers. Because
Yeah.
you're paying for 5, 6 days of a fully painted cover from them, so they've moved away from interior art. They literally only do cover art now.
Well, that makes sense because at the end of the day, if you want to do like a 100-page graphic novel, which do exist, and if you're paying $250 a page, that's a huge cost, and
It is
that's a huge project to endeavor as well.
it's a huge investment, and of course everyone always complains they charge too much, but at the end of the day, you're paying for their years of experience and the skill set they've learned over time. So you get what you pay for effectively.
Well, it's that, and it's also the case of like, and this is one of the things I really like about books is like once it's written, once you have a printed book, like this isn't going away. This is going to linger and frankly probably outlast us all. And it's the same with artwork. Once you pay for that one-time investment to create the artwork, then you're set. You're good to go. I will say, just because it's a very serialized process, I imagine once, like if you've done book one with one artist, the if you do book two, but the original artist isn't available, I can imagine that's where it starts to get tricky.
Yeah, you do kind of want consistency. And that's just changing themes between books, of course.
Mhm.
You may have an artist, but you may just because it's the same character or whatever, your themes may dramatically change. It may go from straight hard sci-fi to comedic. So
Yeah.
the change of artist might not matter as much. And there are artists who you can kind of pick an artist because their work resembles someone else.
So because there's more of a lack of accessibility in this medium, what advice would you have for writers who are script comics or who would love to get into this, but they're not necessarily trained in visual storytelling? What are resources available out there to help better kind of learn how to get into the artwork or really just get into the process itself?
The aforementioned Peter David book, I think it's called Writing Comics with Peter David, is like it has become my Bible, as in the fact it is
Okay.
virtually fell to pieces. And because it's been around for a while, you can get it relatively cheap secondhand as well. He talks about every element of the industry in that, from how he got in, how to approach comic companies, how to script, pacing, pretty much everything you would want is in that book. I would also recommend Jeff Vandermeer, who was the guy who wrote script for Annihilation, the Netflix
Okay.
sci-fi film. He's got a book called Wonder Book, which, as well as being a beautiful objet d'art, it's a brilliant reference on world building, which is just as applicable to writers as it is to writers across the entire spectrum. So not just prose, but screenwriters and comic writers as well. Other than that, there are lots of examples of comic scripts online if you want to
Mhm.
see other writers' examples, a lot of them alongside the finished work as well. So if you do want to compare scripts with what the finished article looked like, there's references for that which I could probably find out and pass the details. And I've got a few of those
Yeah, because
bookmarked.
we can always and I'll work to put these books that you recommend and we can add them to the comments or
Okay.
not the comments, the little blurb that comes underneath. Mhm.
And to get into the industry, indie's a good way. There's always comics out there looking for writers or artists in the indie scene.
Mhm.
And if you want to break into any of the bigger ones, 2000 AD in the UK, they often do at Comic Cons pitching script ideas to them to appear in future copies of 2000 AD. So there's always avenues out there. I mean, what's quite interesting is that my first comic work is all based on my short stories. It's been a while since until I had to actually write a comic script from scratch. A lot of them has just been adapted from my short stories into that format, which is quite interesting
Oh,
to
I need to follow up
to
on
compare
that
the
then.
two.
I absolutely need to follow up on those because
Well,
I've read plenty of your short stories. So
what it will do is Thrice Slain recently was made into a comic, so I'll send through the comic script for that. I'll put a link of that on my blog, and so people can see the comparison from between script and prose.
oh, bless. Well, thank you. And yeah, no, thank you so much for this. It's really insightful. As someone who I enjoy a good comic book, but it's not something that I've really considered how to build. And especially since we've been working on YPQ for so long, we've seen how a regular book from beginning to finish gets built. The
Yeah.
idea of how a comic book gets built is just so, so different. So it makes sense why you would almost make one big comic book and then break it up into chunks to get kind of more bang for your buck as well.
Well, I fell into this quite by accident. I'd never intended to write, despite the fact I've always been a huge fan of comics. I'd never really considered myself a comic writer, but
Hmm.
literally the opportunity came up of someone was taking script submissions. So I thought I've got something with a twist ending that'll adapt quite well to that. So it's weird how sometimes you just kind of find yourself gravitating towards this, and you end up being quite successful at it, which is quite nice.
Well, on that note, thank you again. And for those of you who want more information, I will put David's what do you call it, Twitter, X, website. I'll put a contact for David,
Yeah, absolutely.
not his
Ask me any questions you
not
like.
his personal phone number,
Not
and
again.
put it in the description below, and we'll go from there. If you have any questions, be sure to ask. But thank you again, David, and take care, everyone. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Ryan.